Welcome to the Hope for Parents with Struggling Teens podcast. I'm Brandon Jaffe. Join us as we explore relationship and mental health issues by weeding out the trends in the mental health industry to uncover what truly works in improving our emotional well-being and relationships. At Inspired Resolutions Counseling, we specialize in providing interventions and resources for families with teens, focusing on topics such as teen mental health, parenting challenges, and family dynamics. Welcome back to Hope for Parents with Struggling Teens podcast. I am going to talk about something that a lot of professionals, parents, people in the world are going to kind of struggle with, I think. I was having a conversation with a friend of mine in the mental health field, and we were just kind of talking about how different things like diagnosing and just overall getting your master's has changed when it comes to psychology, social work, marriage and family therapy. And for those of you who don't know, the big degrees that you get if you want to work with people in clinical psychology, which means you want to do one-on-one work, group work, you want to do talk therapy, is you get a master's in social work, which is what I have. You can get master's in marriage and family therapy, or you can get your psychology degree. And then you can go on to get PhDs, you get your master's, and then you get your license. And now there's been a couple of degrees that have been added since I was in school, but that's a whole nother conversation. But something that we noticed is, number one, when we're interviewing people who have just gotten their degree, they have a really hard time with two pieces of information. When we ask them about theory, which is what all good therapy should be based on. When we ask them about theory, it's almost as though they got some sort of Cliff Notes version of theory rather than really digging in and learning theory to practice, which when you're practicing from theory, that really is what delineates you from just a life coach. No offense to life coaches out there, but when you are a therapist, you have a board that you answer to. You're not just practicing and giving your opinions all willy-nilly. You are accountable for the work that you do with clients. But I don't want to digress into that too much. But the two things that we noticed is, number one, diagnosis is the training in diagnosis is very minimal. And then for some reason, the theory, these people we were interviewing just didn't learn it, or if it's not being taught, I'm not sure exactly what's going on, but we've noticed a decline in that. And I think a lot of people in society right now are talking about how school has changed, that you can get through college and a master's program not knowing what you used to have to know in order to get through and pass and get your degree. So what I want to talk about, though, is something that's become kind of foundational for working with mental health, and that's diagnosis. And when I was learning about diagnosis, I can remember several professors discussing the fact that providing good care can be done with or without a diagnosis, and that diagnosis was something that, number one, got professionals on the same page. Number two, provided a foundation for treatment planning. So every time you see a client, you should formulate a treatment plan with goals. What are you working towards? Unfortunately, a lot of therapists these days bring you in and just kind of work on whatever instead of really digging in with their clients and figuring out, okay, these are my objectives, these are the goals, and revisiting those goals for therapy. You should be revisiting those at least every once in a while. I remember the other thing that they taught in school was that diagnosis was for getting paid by insurance companies as well. And so that was the third piece to it. We've come to a place, I think, in society where we know a lot about mental health. Most people right now are pushing for more mental health care. Schools are providing care. We have schools that contract with us. Workplaces are providing mental health days, and Society very quickly has gone from refusing to talk about mental health, acknowledge mental health, go from not making it important to it's very important. And it is something that people talk about often on a daily basis. In fact, most large workplaces have some sort of self-care, mental health type training. And so we've come a long way. And I love that. Being a mental health expert and a therapist, I'm glad that the pendulum has swung. There are some side effects. There are some consequences to this. Everybody can Google, read up on diagnosis, on treatments for diagnosis. And so we have a lot of paraprofessionals or people who think that they're professionals weighing in on their opinion. And if they have a dynamic personality, they are going to convince and sway a lot of people. Then what I was talking about before, I don't think that we're training the new generation of therapists nearly enough in the both science and art of diagnosis. And then it takes a lot of work. I think that we've come to a place in society where we are not used to doing the work. When you're working with a client, it might take a long time to get to a diagnosis. And I'm going to talk about some of that process right now, because I think that it's important that everybody does understand at least a little bit of what coming to a healthy and right conclusion regarding diagnosis should look like. We've got some dynamic people who are not professionals who are preaching things. When I look at posts about ADHD, man, this diagnosis, if you were to believe social media, anything online, and the numbers, just the numbers that we see coming into our practice, it seems as though every 1 out of 2 or 3 people has ADHD. And that can't possibly be true for any mental health diagnosis, because the whole point of the mental health diagnosis is that it is an anomaly. It is something that the average person does not have or experience. And the other piece of it is it gets in the way of what we call normal human everyday functioning, relationally, emotionally, intellectually. It's really important to keep in mind that in order to have a diagnosis, it has to be the thing that's getting in the way of your ability to function significantly. Not that it's annoying, not that it's a little bit of a hurdle for you to jump through. At least when I was taught, it is something that causes significant lack of functioning. We don't have a number for that significant, but overall, when I was in school, there was kind of a general consensus as to what that meant, and you would discuss that in depth, and you would read examples, and you would watch videos of examples so that people were on the same page when diagnosing. Now, there's such a widespread interpretation of diagnosis. In some ways, it's okay, because people are getting help, but in some ways it's preventing people from getting help, or at least getting the help that they really need. And I'll give you an example. If you come in insisting that you have ADHD and you can't let that go, and you get that diagnosis and you're on medication for ADHD, and when you first get on the medication for ADHD, things get better. So you tell yourself, oh, yes, I was and am diagnosed with ADHD, and that is the correct diagnosis. Well, if you don't actually have that diagnosis, if your only issue was that you weren't paying attention, but you have all these other factors, such as some poor choices that you might be making, such as possibly, in many cases I've seen, using a significant amount of weed, or you have some sort of stimuli or habit in your life that is creating the distraction, or maybe you have something going on relationally or in your family that is creating that distraction and making it so that you cannot focus. If you go on believing you have ADHD and that's why you don't focus well, but there are other reasons that you are not focusing, then the moment you take the medication for a while, you're going to get better, because ADHD medication often helps just about anybody focus better in the short run. The other thing is there is going to be kind of a placebo effect. When you think that you found an answer, you're going to feel better whether you found the real answer or not in some cases, not all cases. But in the long run, what'll happen is if there's something else that is responsible for that lack of being able to pay attention, then those issues are going to grow and your attention and your work is going to be going into the ether, right? Because you're treating something that isn't actually the issue. And I'm on the stance when it comes to ADHD that most people who have been diagnosed with ADHD do not have ADHD. It's an easy diagnosis. It's one that people often seek out for whatever reason. And even if you do have ADHD, we need to be holding ourselves more accountable with or without that diagnosis. But that's a whole nother discussion. So I want to talk about foundations and baselines for mental health, because in the training that I had, you really have to find a baseline, or at least attempt to find a baseline, before you can give an accurate diagnosis. And so in my opinion and in my training, diagnosing somebody without attempting to find some sort of baseline is totally pointless. And some of the ways you find that baseline is looking at the history before the reported problems arose. Sometimes it's taking a look at what other factors might be leading to the symptoms that the client is reporting. When I learned diagnosis, and I know that this is not being taught in many cases just because I do hire associates and I interview many people throughout the year who would like to come work for us. But something that I think has been lost is that we used to talk a lot about ruling out. And so you would rule out diagnoses. You could have a combination of symptoms that could potentially fit into 1, 2, 3, maybe several possible diagnoses. And then you go through a systematic process to put the symptoms into the right column. If paying attention is a real problem, often, but then you figure out, wow, it's only at school that paying attention is a problem, then you want to make sure to write that down as kind of part of your baseline history exploration. And then let's say that you're trying to figure out a baseline for depression. You're looking for the baseline mood, and let's say that somebody has significant issues going on in their life. And then on top of that, they have some sort of a medical issue. Well, if you can account for the mood fluctuations, and they make sense because of what is happening in that person's life and the medical issue, then you rule out, by placing the symptomology into those columns, you rule out certain other diagnoses. And again, things have changed, but back when I was being trained, you wanted to be very careful, and you almost never did what my professor at the time called double dipping. You didn't want to put lack of attention into being because of depression and ADHD and because of an anxiety disorder. If you had all three of those disorders, you really wanted to be careful. And if you did do what this professor called double dipping, you would only be able to do that by taking the history and making an assessment showing that the symptom is present during certain situations and because of those situations, and then separately over here because of those situations. I know that sounds complicated. I am not explaining it all that well. I just want to set you up to kind of understand. And so in diagnosis, you want to figure out the baseline. That is, where would you be at if there were no problems? And I know that can be hard because if somebody has a long history of problems, you don't know that. But you do your best to figure out where the baseline might be for your mood, for your anxiousness, okay? And another example of a baseline might be figuring out what somebody's anxiety levels to certain circumstances, and has it all of a sudden risen without it making sense. When we're diagnosing an anxiety disorder, we want to ask ourselves, not is this person anxious all the time, but what is their natural kind of baseline for anxiety? And then also, we do want to make a judgment as to what would be a normal anxious response be in the situations that these people are living in. It's important to figure out, and I'm repeating myself, what else might be adding to the problems, to their emotions, to their feelings, to their relational issues, right? And is that response appropriate? If I have a teen that comes in and says, I'm anxious all the time, and I peel back the layers and I do some assessment and I realize, wow, you know what? In the average daily life without stressors, their baseline for anxiousness is pretty low. And then when you add in certain triggers, their anxious baseline goes, their anxiety levels, go up pretty significantly. What would it look like? What would other people be doing? How would they respond to these stressors? So if I have a client and I can remember somebody that had a pretty severe anxiety disorder, and they were very motivated, interestingly, but this teen was getting A's, had friends, was doing well with studies, but was terrified of going to school. Similarly, I'll often work with teens who say they have been diagnosed with an anxiety disorder, and then I find that the anxiety disorder is absent the summer months, which means it's being triggered by school. And then you find out that, you know what, their anxiety is actually pretty relevant. It's pretty appropriate because they've made decisions and they have behaviors at school that are putting them in a constant state of, somebody's going to come down on me. Somebody's going to come down on me. And if you continually have that sense of, oh my gosh, I didn't do what I was supposed to, or I did this thing that I was told not to, and then on top of it, you're having social issues. Well, you don't have an anxiety disorder. You have anxiety that is appropriate. Now, you still might need help and help figuring out some relational issues in your life and some habit issues in your life. However, when that gets diagnosed as an anxiety disorder, but the anxiety is appropriate for the situation, it's just that situation's coming up over and over again, and you get on medication for anxiety, and then you get accommodations for anxiety. The problem is you don't learn to deal with life on life's terms, and that was your real issue. Your issue wasn't that you had an anxiety disorder. The issue was that certain behaviors and decisions was creating appropriate anxiety on a regular basis in your life. When you get those accommodations, your brain never learns, never grows in the way that it needed to grow so that you could overcome those issues. When you're a professional and you are diagnosing, it's important, number one, that you understand what you're diagnosing. And if there is something that you don't understand in the DSM, that you take accountability for that and you do your diligence in studying, in reading, in learning. It's also important as a professional that you don't just throw people in, that we should not be giving people so many different diagnoses. I recently had somebody come into me with 5 different diagnoses, and that doesn't make sense. And before they came to me, they were not getting the care that they needed. They had been on a multitude of different medications that didn't work. They had done many different treatments that didn't work. As we peeled back the layers, as we went through the process of undiagnosing, finding the foundation through the history, and then putting aside the need for the diagnosis for a little while and just taking a look at what are the symptoms that are causing a problem, what is resulting in the lack of functioning, and then through creating the goals for what the client wanted changed, they came to realize, and I came to realize, and then their psychiatrist came to realize that there was only one mild diagnosis that was actually appropriate. And again, we did that by taking a look at a baseline, by not throwing any and all diagnoses against the wall, by figuring out what was actually inappropriate, what was actually symptomology and what was actually appropriate in terms of the situations and the life situations that this client was going through. And that process led to more growth, this client said, than I forget how many years, but many years of therapy with other people. Finding the foundations for baseline. You have to figure out what the baselines are. You have to figure out where the symptoms actually belong before you do any diagnosing and prescribing, especially. And then you've got to build a foundation for mental health before you take the medicine, before you participate in the outrageously expensive treatment programs. You really want to ask yourself, what do I actually have control over? And I talk about this all the time. This is where I can begin to build a foundation or a baseline for building my mental health. What in my routine, what in my daily habits, what in terms of the things that I control am I not controlling? Where can I take accountability for doing the wrong thing regarding my mental health? As I talked about in podcasts previously, when you build that foundation for routine, when you start focusing on little steps to take control over the things that you control, what happens is your therapist, your doctor, can do a much better job of figuring out the diagnosis, or even if there should be a diagnosis. And this is an example from another case, a client who insisted that they had ADHD. And it took time, but we changed their schedule. We changed their sleeping schedule. We got them involved in some healthy things in their life. We eliminated some stimuli from their life. We did things like reducing TV time. And then we also discussed their routine for nutrition. And I told them what happened was this client had been given this diagnosis for many, many, many years, way before they met me. And nothing had ever changed, not the medication, not the treatment. And so I had suggested maybe we need to take a look at, maybe we need to get your daily life into the best routine that we can to see what happens with the symptoms. We need to figure out which symptoms are being caused by your daily decisions and which symptoms are a result of a mental health disorder. And this was really tough. What this client figured out was a couple of things. They figured out that they had a pretty severe food addiction. And then they figured out that they had been minimizing their lack of sleep or their sleep issues, their sleep routine actually, to the nth degree. And so we started addressing their food addiction. And that was the first diagnosis I put on their chart. And then they started taking a look at their sleep issues. And they had taken medicine for sleep issues. They had done anything and everything except doing something very simple, which was get really tired during the day, get in the habit of going to bed at the same time and waking up at the same time. And I always tell people our healthy mental health brains and our bodies really want to go to bed early and get up early. And so as this person made those changes, we then changed their treatment plan into addressing some relational problems in their lives. And so nutrition was being addressed, routine, sleep, daily schedule was being addressed. And then they started to unfold some of the relational issues that they were having. And as I heard some of these relational issues, I'm going, oh my gosh, I would be distracted, just as distracted as you. You're going through a lot relationally. And they had minimized the chaos that the relationships in their lives were playing. And so now we've got this different lens on, because the symptoms make sense if you say, hey, look, somebody who has a food addiction, who has this many chaotic relationships in their life, who has chosen to not exercise and to not sleep at the right times, we can put all of the symptoms into all of those areas and explain them away, which doesn't leave room for their diagnosis of ADHD. And so as they tackled all of these issues through the treatment planning, they had forgot over a long period of time with me. They forgot that they had come into me asking me to help them with ADHD. And they had been talking to a relative who they didn't see very much, who said, "Oh my gosh, your medication must be working really well. You seem so different." Which was mind blowing to my client. My client couldn't wait to come in because they had this discussion that they were really proud of, that no, they weren't on medication. They hadn't been on medication, and they weren't attributing anything to the diagnosis of ADHD. And so it was kind of this mind blowing moment for the client, because they realized, wow, I even forgot that I came in with the diagnosis of ADHD. I became so enthralled and so focused on working in the areas that needed to be fixed, in the areas of my life that were, they said this word, broken, that I stopped thinking about the ADHD diagnosis. They went on to say that they had taken on the ADHD diagnosis as their identity for a significant part of their life, and they felt like that had done them such a disservice. And it's the same. And I remember thinking in this conversation, man, it's the same thing. When you get misdiagnosed, you lose an opportunity to get better. When you're focused on trying to fix something that isn't the actual issue, you miss out on the opportunity to heal, to find things that actually work. And it's the same thing, because on the other end, if you do not get the right diagnosis, you sometimes can miss out on the opportunity to get better. I think that it is just as important to figure out the right diagnosis as to figure out what are the wrong diagnoses. And again, to circle it back in the day when I was in school, and I can't believe it's been so long since I've been in school, but back in the day, they really were sticklers for ruling out diagnoses. And my professors were real sticklers for making sure that nobody got diagnosed with something that wasn't supposed to be diagnosed. And I remember it being really embedded into my brain. Hey, a diagnosis is not necessary for getting mental health help. All that's necessary for getting mental health help is that somebody is not functioning in the way that they want to function, that they are not finding the happiness that they want or that they deserve. And I'll never forget a professor of mine telling the class that diagnosis was mostly a result of the insurance companies, and that in time, someday, the insurance companies were going to ruin the ability to provide the care that we really need to give people for mental health. And I'm seeing that. I'm seeing that in the world. I'm seeing that in this, what I think is a crisis, where people are being overdiagnosed instead of just told, hey, you can get help without a diagnosis. And then I'm seeing it professionally in that most people in private practice do not take insurance. We will not take insurance because the insurance companies incorrectly run your practice once you decide to take insurance. And they can just say, hey, we're not going to pay for certain sessions, et cetera. So it becomes a nightmare in terms of administration. But the other issue is, I don't know, this is opinion, I don't know this for sure, but I don't know that you can truly treat somebody based on what the insurance companies make you do. In order to follow the procedures of the insurance company, I don't know how you provide true and ethical care. But again, that's a whole nother conversation. But this diagnosis for mental health becomes a real touchy subject. But I want everybody to walk away today with the fact that in getting mental health care, I really want you to think about the baseline first. How can you figure out what your baseline should be? And then figure out, is there another explanation for some of these symptoms other than sticking me in this column of this diagnosis that might lead me to certain medications I don't need or treatment that I don't need to pay for? But really be careful and don't do it on your own. If you're in treatment right now, bring this idea and concept up with your therapist. I know many therapists who, once I have this conversation with them, they'll go back to their cases and rethink them. They'll have new, different conversations with their clients. And remember, we are practicing. There should be some science to it. There should be a lot of science to medical health care. But at the end of the day, we're all practicing. This field is growing, and we don't want it to stop growing just because there is this push for diagnosis and this is going to be a weird thing for me to say, but it's a real weird phenomenon. What I'm seeing is the pendulum swung so far that now people desire to have, not everybody, but there are some people who desire to have a mental health condition. And I don't know if that's because they want certain accommodations. I don't know where that's coming from for sure. But what I'm saying is that in some cases, for some people, they're looking to have a diagnosis, even when there is no diagnosis to be made, which I hope that I haven't offended anybody. I'm just throwing some words out there, things to think about, in the spirit of I really want the care that our profession can provide to keep getting better and better. I don't want trends and fads in society to dictate what care we are able to give to the clients that we care most about.
The Hope for Parents with Struggling Teens podcast is an Inspired Resolutions production. Hosted by Brandon Jaffe. Edited and mixed by Natalie Atkinson. Music by Natalie and Sean Atkinson. Inspired Resolutions Counseling is based in Yorba Linda, California. Whether you're interested in joining our group, seeking therapy services, or exploring more of our resources, you can find us on our website, Instagram, Facebook, or YouTube at Inspired Resolutions Counseling.